Well, good hello. You are tuned in to Glofcast 7, and this week's episode is brought to you by nobody. Do you honestly think this shit gets sponsored? No, I'm just kidding. We are totally sponsored. Now, this week's sponsor is fake, but we're sponsored by Dole's Barbecue. Barbecue's so good you'll kill people, and it's free range bitch. And it's the only barbecue to fall off the bone twice. How do they do it? It falls off once, and then they put it back on with their bare hands, and it falls off again. Sanitary? Not really, but whatever. And it also won Dole's Choice Award 2009 through 2014 straight, which is especially impressive considering it was founded in 2016. But that's that's Dole's Barbecue. Here are some testimonials. The infamous Pastor Charles says, I gave up my life of crime for this shit. Karen S says, it's too spicy. Muhammad A says, Dole is an infidel, but the shit's so good I don't even care. And Ted K calls Dole's the only good thing to calm out of the Industrial Revolution. So, hope you appreciated that. Anyways, enough fake ads, because this week we're going to talk about something that is, in my opinion, the defining cultural ethos of the 2010s, and it's a little concept known as hauntology. Now, this is a concept that I've been really into for about the past year. For some reason, I just find it completely fascinating. And I know there's been quite a few videos and podcasts done on it recently. So there's a YouTuber called Cuck Philosophy that made a really good video on it. But if you see yourself as a kind of culture builder in the Patrick Coffin sense of the word, I don't know if you follow him, he's pretty good. It's a term I like, but in my opinion, it's a little bit too broad a catch-all. But anyway, a culture builder could be anybody that means producing music, art, or other content, or just talking about the cultural landscape as a whole. And I think if you consider yourself kind of that, or if you kind of want to be involved in that in some sort of way, you do well to be aware of the concept of hauntology. So what is hauntology? So the term hauntology is a portmanteau of the words haunt and the word ontology. So everybody is aware of what it means to haunt, and they most notably, when they think of the word haunt, they think of ghosts, they think of haunted houses. The paranormal, spirits or ghosts making their presence known at a particular location or during a particular event. So actually the term to haunt means to visit frequently, which leads one to believe that at a place such as a haunted house, the entity haunting the house is not actually there physically, and for all intents and purposes there, I guess you could say, permanently. So rather, the entity returns to the house or visits the house frequently every time a supernatural phenomenon happens at the house. So think of the entity as being there but not there at the same time, if you will. Think of it as existing and non-existing almost simultaneously. And the latter part of the portmanteau is the word ontology, which is the philosophical study of being. So it looks at questions such as, what does it mean to be, etc. And now think about that for a second. The term hauntology, it's a combination of two words. So one word studies being, it's literally the study of being. And the other word refers to visiting frequently, or for our purposes, existing and non-existing, or being and not being. So if this sounds like a paradox to you, that's because it is. If we want to come up with a cohesive definition of hauntology using only the etymology, call it the study of simultaneous being and non-being. So the guy who coined this term was a French postmodernist philosopher named Jacques Derrida, and he did note its paradoxical qualities when he first coined this term in his 1993 work, Spectres of Marx. So Derrida defined hauntology in, I would say, kind of an almost esoteric kind of way. It's almost, when you first hear it, you're just kind of like, wait, what? But he defined it as a type of disjunction in which the presence of being is replaced by a non-origin. So he goes on to state that this is represented by the figure of the ghost, which is neither present nor absent, nor dead nor alive. And so that kind of alludes to the idea of haunting, which I talked about earlier. And it's the thing with the presence of being it was replaced by a non-origin, that's a little bit more esoteric, but I think you can't really point to I'm going to just kind of take a stab at this real quick, but I think he's pointing to it's the non-origin. You can't really point to where the being ends or begins, and that kind of adds a little bit of a layer of complexity to it. So what's particularly ironic is that in Derrida's native French language, the words hauntology and ontologie, with the word haunt in English at the beginning of it, they are pronounced exactly the same. And so in a way, in speaking, this offers kind of an immediate example of a good example of hauntology, because when you say hauntology in French, it literally sounds like the word ontology, so you may as well be saying ontology, but that's not necessarily, I guess, what it is, unless you see it written down. So the easiest way to envision hauntology from kind of a historical standpoint is think of the fall of communism, quote unquote, in 1991. And so think of this, what did this kind of mark for those of us in the West? It marked the triumph of capitalism over communism, ushering in the 1990s as a type of end of history. Although the death of communism has manifested itself as a specter of communism or ghost of communism. Now, the specter of communism haunts history. I think Derrida or Marx said that, just as the specter of history haunts communism, since at the time the term hauntology was coined, history was supposedly at its end. And I'll kind of talk about that a little bit more at the end of this podcast. And in Western societies, one where communism does not have hold, the spectrum of communism does remain, which means that the idea of communism is, I would say, still highly present in the public consciousness, whether or not that's good or bad. Some view it as good, others view it as bad, but the fact of the matter remains is that the specter of communism still exists in the public mind. So if the definition of hauntology sounds a bit convoluted to you, bear in mind that Derrida did intend for the definition to be up for interpretation. There's no really, at least maybe when he coined it, but in my opinion, there's really no set way of saying this is hauntological, this is not, because you could almost draw the definition to kind of cover almost any piece of media nowadays, in my opinion. But before viewing it in terms of just communism, bear in mind that the idea behind hauntology exists much more broadly than that, since it's a philosophical, specifically a postmodernist philosophical term. So you can apply it to history, but you can also apply it to several other things. So another cultural theorist or philosopher who has worked with and expanded upon the concept of hauntology is Mark Fisher. This is kind of his baby in a way. And he does speak about hauntology in the collection of essays called Ghosts of My Life, Depression, Hauntology, and Lost Futures, which he uses hauntology in that group as kind of an overarching catch-all for the group of essays. So if this idea of hauntology still sounds a bit esoteric and a little bit like, what the hell, or if Derrida's definition also has you kind of shaking your head and being like, why, like, what, I don't know what this postmodernist bullcrap is. Adam Harper, actually, he had a really good detailed blog post about hauntology, which I will include in the description. And he offers a definition of a haunting of the presence by specters that cannot be ontologized away. Which, when he ontologized away, that can be kind of, excuse me one sec. Sorry folks, I had to cough. But what he means by ontologized away, the way I understand it, is put into an ontological category. So being or non-being. So with it's a haunting, the specters that he's talking about, you can't really put them in an ontological category. You can't really say they are or they are not. And so I just realized that this isn't any less confusing, so I'll do my best to summarize it for you as simply as I can without being reductionist, although it probably will be. Or if you don't feel like re-listening to the first part of the podcast over and over. So for our purposes here today, and for a cultural analysis interpretation, view hauntology as simply the past inside the present. I think that's It's a little bit too simplistic, but I think it will do for our purposes today. So this leads you to ask, it led me to ask, kind of why does hauntology even exist, or what's the point of it? So, like anything else in postmodern philosophy, which kind of leads itself to largely deconstruction of meta-narratives, the purpose of hauntology is deconstruction, with the general purpose being to realize that nothing exists in a vacuum. So Adam Harper shows us a really good example of this using a postcard, which I will actually link in the description. But I'm kind of going to describe it to you if you don't want to listen to this. Sorry. The postcard is essentially from the late 1980s, 1989, I believe, and it shows a small child in a woodland field dressed in, childish clothes and playing with a small woodland animal. It's a little bit kitschy, so it's almost a little bit over sentimentality or gaudy in a way, but it's still a sweet picture. Harper describes the scene as utopian, but in reality, I don't know if I describe it as utopian, but I can kind of see what he meant. In reality, it's just a cute little postcard you would send to your grandparents, which, if not utopian, it just paints a pretty picture. However, you must keep in mind that, like any other piece of media, this postcard does not exist in a vacuum. And so, in fact, this postcard is marked as being from 1989 from the East German Democratic Republic, the socialist state which was in the Soviet bloc during the Cold War and which continued up till this point to be occupied by Soviet forces until the dissolution of the GDR in 1990. Now, the GDR in 1989, it was... I really would not describe it as utopian at all. So it was rife with social unrest, protests, censorship, the infiltration of the secret police known as the Stasi. So you can see it's not exactly a utopian paradise. Now, this is contrary to what the postcard would have you believe. So it's, like I said, the GDR at this point in time was actually rather dystopian. So it's actually a little bit ironic that the postcard is portraying it as this utopian paradise. So, as you can see, the postcard most definitely does not exist in a vacuum. So, while the context of the postcard may not change the intention of the postcard, one cannot deny that the postcard is haunted, quote-unquote, by the context in which it was created. Despite trying to paint a pretty picture, the postcard cannot escape its context. Now, think of this in two layers. The first layer, the surface layer, the layer that you see immediately and don't really think about. The one that doesn't require context to enjoy. But underneath this layer exists the hauntological layer, which essentially seeks to deconstruct the surface layer by examining it through the lens in which it was actually created. So by adding this layer of hauntological deconstruction, a layer of irony and playfulness is added to the entire work in question. So the postcard specifically, it's a pretty ironic postcard since it paints a pretty utopian scene of the GDR, despite the GDR being one of the more dystopian areas of the world around the late 80s, early 90s. So I know this is a podcast, so you can't necessarily see what I'm talking about right now unless you did click the link in the description. So I'll allude to another example using music. Now, one can see bits and pieces of hauntology within music since the 1990s, but there have been multiple musical genres where hauntology as a philosophical and musical concept has been a staple. And the best example that I'm going to give is Vaporwave. So, I don't know if you listened to any previous episodes of Glofcast, but in episode 5 was about Hobo Johnson and metamodernism. And that although Hobo is not, I would say, the first or maybe the best, but he's, in my opinion, he represents the example that allows me to demonstrate metamodernism the most easily. So that's kind of why I chose him for that exercise. He was highly, highly contemporary. At that point, he's a pretty new artist on the scene, but he represented something which I think was kind of brewing among other artists, but with Hobo Johnson especially, you could take a look at him and be like, yep, I see what you mean. So take that relationship and apply it to vaporwave and hauntology. So Hobo Johnson and metamodernism, compare that to vaporwave and hauntology. So vaporwave, it's not the first musical movement to recognize hauntology or utilize it, but rather it represents the best example, in my opinion, of using it. It allows me to kind of illustrate my example the best way. And so there are obviously other musically hauntological movements within this, which I'll kind of go over at the end of the podcast. If you're interested in this concept as a whole, you can kind of take a look at other mediums of music. One of my favorites is Ariel Pink and then John Mouse, the hypnagogic pop in the US, or the UK actual hauntological scene, best represented by Broadcast and the Focus Group. But vaporwave is what we're going to look at right now. So if you're listening to this, I'm going to assume you kind of know what vaporwave is. You've listened to some vaporwave or whatever, but I'm still kind of going to give a rough primer on it. So yeah, you probably heard some vaporwave before. You probably know what it is, but a rough primer on vaporwave is that it's a microgenre that appropriates 80s and 90s smooth jazz music, Japanese music, basically East Asian music, 80s, 90s popular hits, basically anything you can find in the 80s or 90s, which it can include pretty much literally anything, such as like elevator music or Kmart tapes or really whatever you find. So whatever you'd hear in a shopping mall in the 80s and 90s. Oftentimes slowed down, chopped and screwed, sampled over and over to make it sound glitchy, weird, or in some respect haunted. So that's a basic catch-all definition, and if vaporwave as a genre sounds a little bit arbitrary, kind of look at what it's doing within a hauntological lens. So the genre, as I've said before, it uses essentially 80s and 90s cultural artifacts, and sometimes 70s, and maybe even 60s. So what it's really interested in is using, you know, like the 80s Kmart music tapes, elevator music, or just really obscure 90s Japanese game show music or whatever. So, it's just stuff nobody would sincerely listen to on its own. But it's what it symbolizes is important. So it's symbolic mainly of a type of global hypercapitalism. And by recontextualizing these 80s and 90s samples to recreate music in the 2010s, vaporwave essentially adds a hauntological layer to the entire thing, which earlier vaporwave especially was used as a type of deconstruction or critique of the hypercapitalism that it got its original samples from. So musically, you can view it as mixing up the past, present, and future in a humongous mixing bowl, which is kind of the genre of vaporwave. And so by doing this, it's intended that the listener can't really tell where the past, the present, and the future kind of lie about. It's all kind of convoluted. And vaporwave especially likes to present itself as faux utopian, or a future that never was, or a past that never was, just kind of stuff like that. And so when I first heard the genre of vaporwave, it was like mid-2014. I kind of thought the entire thing was kind of a joke. So I began listening to it ironically, as if to say, well, I'm in on this joke. I think it's kind of funny. So I can't really explain why I did it. It was just kind of there. I was just like, this is kind of creepy and kind of weird and a little bit stupid, frankly. I mean, it's not really, production-wise, there's nothing super impressive about it. And so I was just kind of like, wow, I'm listening to this. Look how goofy it is, you guys. And you kind of expect it to stay a small underground niche, but over time I actually began listening to it sincerely, which I thought I shocked myself, frankly. So I thought, what the hell, I actually like this. And as the vaporwave genre moved on, it kind of left its ironic capitalist critique phase to kind of become more of a genre in its own right. Although the hauntological elements that have been present throughout its life remain. Now, the lost or the fake future presented by vaporwave and other hauntological pieces of media, it gives an illusion of, by presenting a fake past or false nostalgia, it gives an illusion of a fake present and a fake past, which is why these hauntological pieces of media are often rife with not only a playful critique, but also a sense of escapism. So that's essentially a quick rundown of hauntology, but it raises the question of why here, why now? Why is it so completely prevalent in the 2010s? So to answer that question, what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of allude and expand upon what I meant when I talked about the end of history earlier on in the podcast. So if we view history as a narrative, so specifically a literal story. So think of history as a story about the human race and how we got to where we are today, more or less. So if you think of history as just a giant story, a giant narrative dictated to us, or rather a giant collection of narratives, or a narrative of narratives, or dare I say it, a meta-narrative. So, history as a meta-narrative. So, postmodernism as a philosophical system is represented by the core tenet of rejecting meta-narratives. And hauntology, it is a kind of a staple of I wouldn't say staple, but it's definitely a large kind of contingent, very relevant contingent of postmodern philosophy. So, with the rejection of meta-narratives, this implies that history is one of the meta-narratives that is or should be rejected. So, contrary to popular belief, the end of history, it doesn't necessarily imply happily ever after on a global scale. But in the words of contemporary historian Keith Jenkins, the end of history represents the peculiar ways in which the past is historicized is coming to an end of its productive life. So he refers to it as the experiment of modernity succumbing to or passing away into the postmodern condition. So basically how I kind of viewed that is how we viewed history in the past. It's essentially becoming less and less, or more and more difficult to do that. So the way we kind of viewed history as the past is historicized, is coming to an end of its productive life. That essentially means it's becoming more difficult to kind of do that as we kind of move on into the future. And so I hope that made some semblance of sense. So the end of history, it's not an eschatological term. It's not a term that really alludes to the end of the world per se, but it simply marks really the peak of progress. And in the 1990s especially, I think if there was any end of history, it was, you could have viewed the 1990s as probably the time it would have happened. And so why wouldn't it be? Like, the Soviet Union fell, capitalism essentially triumphed over communism, the economy was booming, 9/11 hasn't happened yet, and the dawn of a new millennium was upon us. We were literally coming into the year 2000. So if there was an actual end of history, those would be some pretty telltale signs as far as I'm concerned. So, I mean, you can't really get much more. This is the best we have, more than those signs right there. So, in my opinion, hauntological elements, they're very prevalent in the 2010s for really multiple reasons, but I think a main one, it's a societal longing for an end of history moment. And so from what I've noticed, and this is kind of just anecdotal evidence on my end, a general cultural attitude of the 2010s, regardless of where one may stand politically, it's a mistrust of the future, or an anxiety of the future and the present. But cultural theorist Mark Fisher, who I've alluded to earlier, kind of the hauntology guy, he also has an interesting take, calling our cultural impasse, it's a result of neoliberalism. So to Fisher, neoliberalism is a source of this and only seeks short-term solutions, ones that adhere to the existing set of neoliberal cultural norms. So when the culture is confined to these cultural norms over time, since we're kind of bogged down to what solutions we can actually seek out, revivalism is going to take a greater and greater hold, because there's really nowhere else for the culture to go but back to the past. And so when the present and future are both a source of anxiety and neoliberalism stunts the collective imagination, it's just natural to retreat to the past, to revive the past. And so this explains our nostalgia-obsessed culture. And when the present obsesses over the past and implements revivalism increasingly repeatedly, This causes the past, present, and future to kind of blend together. So we see false past and false futures that could have been but weren't. And so it's kind of almost a betrayal. The future's essentially betrayed us. So that's kind of why hauntology is kind of taken the hold that it has. And so you combine the false past, the false nostalgia, and revivalism of cultural artifacts that I don't think really originally had any intention of being revived, and why would they? That's kind of hauntology in a nutshell, folks. So for our purposes, view it in just as a kind of a false nostalgia. That's probably the best. If you want to simplify it to its extreme degree, that is the way you do it. And so I did say earlier, if you did want a glimpse into hauntological media, Vaporwave gives the best example. So obviously Vectroid is kind of the Floral Shop is kind of the poster child of the Vaporwave genre. If you somehow don't know about that, yeah, check it out. Obviously, otherwise, there's Telepath. I really like his work. HKE, Death's Dynamic Shroud, Esprit, Vectroid. I said that. Macintosh Plus, James Ferraro, Oneotrix Point Never as Chuck Person. And so these are all pretty introductory Vaporwave artists, but I think for anybody who kind of wants to get a greater glimpse into hauntology, or kind of just the Vaporwave genre as a whole, you kind of owe it to yourself to kind of listen to these people. It's not as big as it was a few years ago, but I still do enjoy it. I'll put on some Telepath once in a while. Also, listen to some hypnagogic pop, so that's obviously Ariel Pink. I really like his work. And then just kind of more normal neo-psych, Neon Indian, Toroi Moi, Animal Collective, really any 21st century psychedelic music, Tame Impala, Animal Collective, Pond, Tobacco, Black Moth Super Rainbow, they all have hauntological elements. Those are just kind of the more, I would almost say more introductory type neo-psych bands. In my opinion, if you really kind of want to get a glimpse into the UK hauntological scene, which was kind of a big thing in the or not a big thing, but it was a thing in the 2000s, Broadcast and the Focus Group's album, Investigate Witch Cults of the Digital Age, I think is a necessary listen. I think it really gives kind of a great glimpse into what hauntology kind of is all about. And I would also listen to Burial's Untrue, and really any album by The Caretaker. The Caretaker especially is a really... in his music, it kind of simulates what it is to have dementia or Alzheimer's disease. So it's very, very sad music, but it kind of represents... It goes a little bit past Vaporwave, and it looks more towards, in my opinion, represents like 1930s sampling in such a way. But it's, The Caretaker is really great. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this kind of gave you, this answered any questions you may have had about hauntology. I'm going to, just a disclaimer, I am not philosophically trained, but I do find philosophy fascinating, and I do show enthusiasm for it, and I'm always willing to learn. So if there was something I said in here that was false, or maybe I needed to expand upon it, please just correct me and let me know. I have also included some sources in the description. Next week, I will actually have my first guest on the show. I will be speaking with Andrew Jokum of the YouTube channel Sorting Myself Out. So I'm really looking forward to that. I also have several other topics I'm going to play out, so take care, and thank you for listening to Glofcast 7, and I will see you next week.